All right. Welcome to the second week of our summer term in intermediate macroeconomics. I know that first week was a lot. It's going to continue being a lot, obviously, because of the nature of the course. But my hope is that when you get to the end or got to the end of the material last week, whenever you happen to consume it, and I'm sure some of you are still consuming it now, the idea here is that we want to start to be able to have in a way, a mental model of the economy, that makes sense to us in our head, and often that requires us to simplify things and to at times maybe remove some reality that we know exists. And then, I think the way that I often think about it in economics is that, we're going to make a simplifying assumption with the plan, the strategy to at some point in the future take away that simplifying assumption in some way, or at least tease it out a little bit, manipulate it, to sort of get at some of those more complex and at times, let's suppose, more realistic ideas, but not, of course, forgetting that simple mental model of the economy is very useful in terms of your ability to, in a way, quickly produce economic analysis. That's in a way the goal of this course is to set you up and equip you with a set of both just sort of mental models. Sometimes the models are complex enough you probably want to write them down, or maybe even just turn them into graphs. I mean, that's really what we're going to do a lot in the remainder of the semester. I mean, there'll be a lot of written math still, of course, but a lot of that will be in service to some underlying graphical representation that I think is for most people eminently easier to grasp onto. But in that vein of adding some reality to our existing model, one thing that we have done up to this point is we have restricted our thinking to the closed model, what we would call a closed economy. Most people, when they first come to economics and they hear this idea of a closed economy, I think it's very understandable why you might very quickly move to that's not realistic, right? Because the economy as it is a very open economy, and when we say open, what we mean is that there are imports and exports in a sense flying about the economy, and that, of course, is going to change some of the underlying dynamics that we have already established. It will, as you will no doubt see, reinforce some of the dynamics that we've already established. That's the one thing about adding things to existing models, that sometimes it generates new ideas. It maybe generates even opposite ideas. We'll see that when we move into the Keynesian stuff later this week, is that some of that stuff ends up being sort of diametrically opposed in ways to that classical model. And then other times when you add things to a model, it reinforces, it strengthens a pre-existing argument. And I always found that to be really interesting. If adding new things to models only ever did one thing, you might call into question the usefulness of it. That it does multiple things, I think, is very useful, and again, sort of strengthens the argument. One of the things in intermediate macro, and I think also intermediate micro, is that you have to make a bit of a case for why we are doing all of this. Why are we doing all this modeling? Why are we making all these assumptions? Why are we at times voluntarily moving ourselves into a theoretical world? And that's because when we need to think about economics, when we need to produce economic predictions, economic analyses, or when we just simply want to think about economics, it's not possible for us to process big data in order to instantly draw empirical conclusions and to be able to make inferences about that underlying analysis. With a theoretical model, you can get to some predictive power much quicker. In a way, though, that reinforces the need to make sure that the theory makes sense, that there's sort of some, commonsensical, almost reasoning nature to the underlying model. And in economics, what's nice is that we have sort of that, rationality, it needs to make sense economically. And because of, the idea of benefits and costs, that becomes a little bit easier for us. So, really, as we move through the course, really see a lot of this as, okay, I'm learning in a way how economists think this part of the economy works. That way I can understand economic predictions, and I can start to in fact make my own economic predictions. That's of course the idea. But without further ado, let's jump into the open economy. So we're going to take that neoclassical model and we're going to open it up. And a couple things change right off the bat. Is that in the open economy model, we sort of get rid of some of the important underlying equilibrium assumptions that we make in the traditional closed economy neoclassical model. In that model, the sort of relationship between spending and GDP was that they would equal each other. It wasn't simply that spending created a GDP, but that the amount of spending in the economy would be equal to the economic value of the output that we created. And that makes a lot of sense because we're not importing or our firms are not exporting products to other countries. So in the closed economy, there's a closed system. And so spending equals output. In an open economy now, of course, because some of that spending might be on imports, some of that investment might be on foreign capital. Now we do not sort of require the restriction that spending equals output. And that starts to sort of get us into interesting territories as well, especially if you move this conversation to the modern era right now, where we're having these sort of arguments and debates about trade and the value of globalization. This sort of spending not equaling output, I think, has an outsized role a bit in that debate. And I think that's kind of what people miss, in a sense, on both sides of that kind of argument is some of this stuff. And then in a sense, even more importantly, and we'll see in a moment that this really is the mechanism that is so interesting here, is that in an open economy, savings does not need to equal investment, because now investment can go elsewhere. And so therefore, what is being consumed and not being consumed no longer is within the economic system, the closed economy. It's now mostly the economy, but then opened up to imports and exports, both in terms of goods, services, as well as capital markets. And so now, domestic savings does not necessarily need to equal domestic investment. Domestic spending does not need to necessarily equal domestic output. And then I think I want to add just a couple of other things here as we're moving through this, just to sort of keep in mind. At the back of our minds, we are making some assumptions about why these trade flows will ultimately occur. We talked about this in the review section at the very beginning of the semester. We assume in economics very often that things happen according to comparative advantage, right? So the trade flows occur according to a minimization of opportunity costs across countries. And the important thing here is that comparative advantage is efficient. It adds this sort of efficient component to economic systems. We believe, in fact, that economic systems that take advantage of international comparative advantages will ultimately be more efficient than economies that do not. So economies that try to make everything within their own borders, even those things they wouldn't necessarily have comparative advantages in, they're going to be at a sort of economic disadvantage ultimately. compared with countries that do trade. That's again sort of economic canon in a way. Now we're not going to sort of for now make any sort of statement about the extent of the benefits of trade and sort of get into that sort of side of the globalization conversation. We're going to do that at the very end. It's going to be one of the last things that we talk about, and I think that's going to be useful because it's so much a part of the sort of conversation as it relates to today. And then the last thing that I want to think about in this sort of open economy setting is that we want to start thinking a little bit now in terms of economic development. Oops, if I can spell development. So the reason why this is sort of important is because we have not up to this point talked much about what causes an economy to grow. We've only merely talked about what are the equilibrium conditions of an economic system. We've made some statement about a production function, but we haven't necessarily talked much about the nature of that production function and how it might develop over time. That's going to be a part of the conversation here because ultimately, as you might imagine, our belief is going to be that the openness of the economic system, the extent to which we have trade liberalization, that's going to have dramatic effects on development, and that's very much an empirical sort of idea, not just a theoretical idea, but very much a empirical one. We see that globalization seems to be very good for economic development. It's uneven. It's very, very uneven, but in a sense, it's sort of the benefits are there. They're not necessarily evenly distributed. Okay, so just to kind of give us some very simple preliminaries here, we'll work ourselves through some very ends up being just some simple algebra that gets us to this idea of net exports. We're ultimately going to focus almost exclusively on the idea here that we have net exports, and net exports are simply exports minus import. This gets us to the sort of classic trade balance. This ends up having a fairly outsized and I would say overrepresented effect in American politics, or maybe even global politics. I'm not sure, but certainly in the U.S., we spend a lot of time worrying about the trade balance, and so that it gives us some nice contemporary sort of discussion opportunities there. But simply speaking, the trade imbalance is exports minus imports. Now, keep in mind that when we talk about sort of this idea of exports and imports, here, we're referring to spending in particular, right? Total foreign spending, spending on foreign goods. So this is in particular a spending model. We could, of course, also think about exports and imports in terms of just sort of unit. But because it's important for us to ground this in that neoclassical model, now that we've got money into the neoclassical model, we're going to think about really, in a sense, the value of exports and the value of imports. And what that's, of course, going to play into is this sort of exchange rate conversation that we're ultimately going to have. All right, so if you just work through, you do some plug and chug here in terms of consumption and investment, given this sort of idea that there is now domestic consumption, foreign consumption, domestic investment, and foreign investment, so on and so forth. One important thing to point out while we're here is that in the context of the development of net exports, we think in terms of the difference between overall consumption and foreign consumption and overall investment and foreign investment. Now, when we say foreign consumption here, we mean domestic consumers buying things, consuming things that are made abroad. Foreign investment here is domestic investors investing in things abroad. And then we also have the sort of, in a sense, government gap. So you can see that all we're doing here is we're just defining the domestic in terms of the total and the foreign, right? And then what that gets us to is simply, this is the classic GDP model, right? C plus I plus G. That's the neoclassical closed economy, and then all we're doing is we're adding net exports to it. So we're just adding exports minus imports to the neoclassical model, right? Now, what this sort of gets us to as well, we can do some manipulation, move net exports around. You can see now that we get this sort of simple identity, which says that the net exports are equal to the difference in overall output minus domestic spending. So how much does your economic system actually produce, and then minus the domestic spending, which of course the difference here being the extent to which goods are, or the value of goods are moving abroad. So you're exporting relative to imports. Traditionally speaking, we've wanted net exports to be growing, right? Because if you're saying that here, if you're saying net exports are a additive function of output, then you've wanted to grow net exports, and so that means you want to grow exports against imports. This is where you start to get into that sort of tradition of being very worried about the trade balance, being very worried about importing more than you export. One of the things that we'll talk about sort of through the development of the course is that becomes one particular feature of more modern economic models that we start to really, in a sense, shy away from. We don't necessarily think, for example, that if you have a trade imbalance, so if imports are greater than exports, we don't necessarily believe anymore that that's going to cause output to go down, right? Whereas in this particular model, that's sort of the basic idea. So you can see how, if you believe in this model, the neoclassical model, you're not going to be a fan of a trade imbalance necessarily. One of the sort of empirical things that we have to grapple with over time is that we don't necessarily see this much. What we see is, in fact, the more a country trades, it tends to put upward pressure on GDP. And again, a lot of that has to do with those efficiency gains that we were talking about before. Because if you're trading imports, if you're for exports, and that's happening because of comparative advantages, then even if you have a trade imbalance, you might be adding efficiency to your economic system. And that's the story that sort of, I would say, mainstream economists believe in. There's some imperfections, I think, in that argument, but empirically, it's pretty solid. We're going to start thinking about capital flows, inflows and outflows. So a capital inflow is going to be framed within that loanable fund. So we're going to think about loanable funds as now existing on this sort of international market. And so we're going to ultimately, though, only consider from a graphical representation what ends up being the domestic loanable funds market. But in the domestic loanable funds market, it will no longer be the case that savings has to equal investment. And then the difference in savings and investment is going to trigger either a capital outflow or a capital inflow. So if savings is greater than investment, when I say savings here, I mean domestic savings. That is, so the amount of available domestic loans is greater than the level of domestic investment demand, right? Which is, we can think about investment here as being investment demand. Then you get this effect where there is more loanable funds than there is demand for loanable funds in the domestic market. And so you're going to have now a capital outflow to foreign markets as a result. And then, of course, if savings is less than investment, and so if we have a discrepancy on the negative side in terms of savings and investment, then we are a borrower. And so now we have capital inflows in sort of that particular sense. So we now think about the extent to which capital is flowing from the domestic market to international markets, or the extent to which capital is flowing from international markets into domestic markets. And of course, this is where you start to get into interesting conversations about foreign direct investment and those sorts of ideas. And so the other thing I think to sort of point out here is that we are definitely thinking in terms of flows. like we have done with respect to GDP so far. So the flow of capital into and out of a country from both domestic and international sources ends up being a really important part, obviously, of the macro economy. So this is just sort of an explanation of this. Right, so you can see savings greater than investment. That's going to put upward pressure on net exports, right? And so that means that capital outflows are occurring. And then if I is greater than S, we're going to have negative net exports. And so you're going to have the capital inflows. Yeah. All right, so this is just some historical data on the US over time. So you can see that there does seem to be this sort of relationship between the two, in the sense that over time in the US, and in particular post 1980, we saw the trade balance decline in the US as a percentage here of GDP downward. So in a sense, the sort of relative importance of exports to the U.S. declined over time. And as you can see as well, the extent to which investment and savings also are represented within as a percentage of GDP is also declining. So it seems to be the case that as savings declines in the U.S., so savings is going down. This is causing investment to go down as we would expect. But this is not, of course, occurring alongside a reduction in economic growth. Economic growth has been sort of strong and consistent over this time period. And of course, the reason why that is that you have the sort of importation, in a sense, of capital. And of course, when you think about this in the context of U.S. manufacturers, for example, importing foreign produced intermediate goods in the production of finished final products, I think this sort of makes a lot of sense and should really kind of coincide with what you already think to be happening in the context of the U.S. economy. Okay, so let's just start to kind of put the model together, and then we'll end this video, and then we'll move on, and we'll talk a little bit about how this relates to exchange rates. So basic model as before. The only difference, of course, we're going to do here is we're going to now have this net export thing on top of it. We're going to think as we did before in terms of the market for loanable funds. In fact, that's going to be where we see the effect of the trade imbalance from before. When it references here chapter 3, by the way, this is in particular ManQ chapter 3, which you have read. So when it says chapter 3 here, you actually do know that chapter 3. Just wanted to point that out. And so we have national savings as we did before. And so we're going to make some assumptions. These are important assumptions. In particular, these two assumptions are especially important here. So there's no preference for domestic versus foreign capital. So in terms of domestic and foreign bonds, same risk, same maturity. This, of course, is not true in the real world very often. This is one of the reasons why the U.S. continues to have such a large trade imbalance, is that our domestic bonds, or the U.S. bonds, are seen as much safer than most other country bonds. So that ends up feeding into the extent to which we have capital inflows, because people are investing, buying U.S. bonds. And then perfect capital mobility. So this means that capital investments can very easily be moved about the sort of world. What this means is that I no longer need to invest in capital in my domestic market because that's the only access to capital I have. I can now invest in foreign capital, and I can get that capital to myself in the domestic market just as easily as I could get domestic capital. Again, in the real world, there's certainly more rigidities. What we refer to these as capital rigidities. So the extent to which there is some value in domestic capital versus foreign capital. But of course, one of the things that's happened is that the sort of extent of globalization has fed into the development of this global financial system. And that global financial system has certainly not created perfect capital mobility, but in the sense that where capital could be mobile, it has become very mobile. And so the sort of financialization of everything has certainly been a big part of that. This last assumption just has something to do with the sort of whether your economy influences global interest rates. Again, the U.S. economy certainly influences global interest rates. We'll talk extensively about that later on. But for this model, we're going to just sort of ignore that. That's not that one doesn't matter as much in terms of kind of do we believe the model or not, because we can change this. It's not hard at all to change this. So, and then lastly, we can move on here. Okay, so set this up real quick. So the demand for loanable funds is the same as before, and again, remember we're going to sort of think about the sort of extent of international investment relative to the domestic market for loanable funds. So when we talk about the supply of loanable funds, that's coming from national savings. When we talk about the demand for loanable funds, that's coming from domestic investors. The difference now is that now domestic investors have access to global markets. And so we'll see how that sort of plays out in just a second. So now, again, if we make the assumption that the domestic market interest rate and the global interest rate are the same, then that would mean that we have the same sort of equilibration process in the loanable funds market. And as a result, we get this I equals S condition that we've seen before. But in a small open economy, now the difference between the domestic interest rate and the foreign interest rate is going to trigger this outflow or inflow process. And so in particular, as we can see here, if the foreign interest rate, which is R star, is greater than the domestic interest rate, and again, the domestic interest rate is the interest rate that equilibrates the domestic lending market. So this is the equilibration of the domestic lending market. Now, what this triggers is ultimately, though, the international interest rate is what governs investment. And so if the international interest rate is above the domestic rate, then investment is going to, in a sense, decline. And when we say investment here, we mean domestic investment. So domestic investment is going to decline. And then what gets filled in as a result is capital outflows. Okay, so if you have higher interest rates abroad, okay, the idea is that capital investors in the US are going to flee, in a sense, to foreign markets. And as a result, you have net export. So you have an increase in capital outflows against capital inflows. And so what is not spent of savings, so this is savings, this is investment here. So this difference here, this is net export. So this is capital outflows, okay? So you can see here that the global interest rate, we're going to say determines investment along the investment line. And then the difference between where we are on the investment line relative to the level of savings is going to be net export, okay? So if you have savings greater than investment, net export has upward pressure, as we saw before. Now, as we always want to do, we can talk about sort of what does policy mean in this particular realm. So let's say that the government decides to, in a sense, run a fiscal stimulus, or just we're not really thinking about it in terms of stimulus now, but let's just say they increase government spending or decrease taxes for whatever reason. We don't need to sort of worry about this. What we can see is that this is going to cause total savings in the economy to decline, right? Because G is growing against T, or T is declining against G. So savings declines. And then because savings declines in the US, the gap between domestic investment and what we get from the foreign markets fall, right? And so we can see that whereas net exports were originally, this horizontal distance here, after the fiscal policy at home, in this case, expansionary fiscal policy, we can see that net exports decline. So the idea here is that expansionary fiscal policy causes net exports to decline. Importantly, does not change the overall level of investment, because the overall level of investment was determined by the international interest rate. Now, what this does do is, you'll notice it does put upward pressure on the domestic interest rate, something to keep in mind. But because investors in the US are already buying, or I should say, investing internationally, then it doesn't actually affect the overall level of domestic investment. It just changes the amount, right, of net exports. Because what's changed here is savings. There's literally less available domestic loan, right? But the actual effect on investment is nothing, because you have this international market. Here we see, again, like I said, really kind of post 1990, I should say, we start to see the trade deficit and budget deficit start to get, and move in the directions we see them now. So we can see that the trade deficit is going down, the budget deficit is getting worse over time, in a sense. So, some nice stylized facts that support some of these particular arguments at home. Now, I think ultimately we're going to feel that this is a little bit more of a nuanced conversation. So, in other words, it isn't the case that expansionary fiscal policy caused us to have this particular trade imbalance, but rather, if you have a trade imbalance, or if let's say you have a trade balance, then expansionary fiscal policy will tend to put downward pressure on that balance. It will tend to push you towards perhaps a more trade deficit type posture, I think is the way to think about it. Now, in addition to something like fiscal policy at home, we're also interested in fiscal policy abroad. And so here we can see what happens internationally. So the idea here is that if we have expansionary fiscal policy, so a foreign government increases government spending or cuts taxes, that's going to increase their interest rates. Okay, remember, in the neoclassical model, the idea here is that if you let's say try to grow GDP via G or T, then this tends to put upward pressure on interest rates. And so the international interest rate is going to be higher now. Because the international interest rate is going to be higher, there's going to be larger gains in the international market. And so as a result, we've seen net exports grow. And so the mechanism here is that expansionary fiscal policy abroad increases interest rates abroad, and therefore causes net exports to grow. In addition to that, or in a sense, importantly, because the actual amount of savings does not change, right? The domestic savings is not affected by foreign fiscal policy, then all that changes here is investment domestically. And so now what we see is that there is a decrease in domestic investment, and we fill that in with foreign investment. So net exports grow, and domestic interest rates, I'm sorry, and domestic investment fall. Okay, that's going to be it for this video, and then we'll do exchange rates in the next one.